Joining a professional body has never been more important. Join thousands of other professionals just like you who are getting ahead with CIHT membership. Go to the CIHT website and discover exclusive resources and why the leaders and future leaders of the sector are members with CIHT.
Welcome, Martin. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be exploring the report Transport-Related Social Exclusion in the North of England. So, I mean, it's an incredibly interesting report. I was wondering, can you tell us a bit about it, sort of how recent it was and some of the key headlines from it?
So this work around social exclusion, and in particular sort of the role that transport has to play, it's been something that's been a piece of work that we've been doing some research on for a little while now. We published the initial results from that research in September of last year, September 22, and that then was used to shape an engagement we did with stakeholders in November last year. And now it's led to the publication of what we're calling our socially inclusive transport strategy, which was published in April of this year. But the essence of it, why is it important, comes right back to the very first strategic transport plan that we published, where we talked about the importance of having inclusive and sustainable economic growth. And we went on as also to talk about how through the investment we're making in the transport system in the North, we improve not just inclusivity, but also health and access to opportunity. So it's been very much at the focus or at the heart of what we've been trying to do for some time. And that's why doing a piece of original research was perhaps the way forward for it.
Excellent. And it actually congratulations. It won the CIHT award very recently on research. So yeah, really groundbreaking piece of research. And I guess the kind of idea of why you undertook this research is quite clear. But in terms of the approach to it, what was the approach to the research in just very brief terms? What was the data approach and also the kind of qualitative side of it, just to give us a feel for how it was actually structured?
Well, I guess there are kind of three elements to it. One, there was we did an evidence review because there has been some work done on social exclusion and transport element, and I think it's always good just to reflect on what's been done in the past. But one of the things that we wanted to make sure we did with this research was to make it applicable to the North. We had a sense that transport-related social exclusion was perhaps a bigger issue for the North. We wanted to understand where it was an issue in the North. And so having done that evidence review, we embarked around quite a comprehensive piece of work around data, drawing on quite easily accessible, publicly available data sets to give us a sense of both what's possible in terms of access to services, but also we talked about in terms of vulnerability, so using things like the index of multiple deprivation. But the third element was also to do some research with people across the North. So a number of ways we could do that, including online interviews and focus groups. But we wanted to kind of supplement that analytical approach with some lived experience, understanding from people what it actually means, because it's quite easy to talk about these things, but if you're not experiencing it firsthand, it's difficult perhaps to comprehend and truly understand what it actually means. So evidence review, quite a lot of data analysis, but also backed up with that research with individuals across the North, gave us the basis for doing the work that's then published.
In that sense, I think the quotes and the stories are almost one of the most powerful bits of it. Some of I'll just read out one. There were jobs going at the business part, but no bus for the early shift. And the manager said it wasn't up to him to deal with that. In the end, 6 of us got there in my mate's old banger with me in the boot. other people saying, yeah, the bus is late so often that I leave home an hour early just to be sure. Otherwise, there'd be no one to open up the shop. I mean, I think it's the stories almost in the report that the thing that really stood out for me. I'm going to ask. You said it's been related to sort of. It's not in terms of the baseline data. In some way, was existing sources and something that had been done before. So I'm going to ask Sara, who's recently done some work at LSE on what are the kind of resonancies of this in the UK, but maybe in Europe as well. Are these sort of similar things we're seeing? So I don't know, Sara, does this, when you looked at this, did this relate to some of the aspects you'd found in your research?
Absolutely, it does. And what is also very interesting is that while the topic has been researched in Europe more widely, the UK is actually leading the research in this topic, having the majority of the reports published specifically on transport-related social exclusion. But more generally, what going through the report really caught my attention were two things. The first one was about the areas in which people are most likely to be impacted by transport-related social exclusion, and then the social groups that are most likely to be impacted. And the areas, for example, we're talking about rural, coastal, or those fringes between urban and rural, which did not came as a surprise for me, because we know that these are economically already areas that have disadvantages in terms of services and accessibility of amenities, which might be scarce and sparse, and also job opportunities, which might be lacking. So if we think about that, and then if we think that people in this area might be more exposed to transport-related social exclusion, then that becomes a circular process that and keeps influencing itself. And also then if we think about the groups that are actually impacted, we're talking about low-income groups, unemployed people, unskilled people, and this we can see it across all Europe. And again, transport-related social exclusion does influence it, and it's something that keeps going. You mentioned, Justin, lived experiences, and I remember going through the report that there is this example of a young adult that is starting their career, and they live in a coastal area, and their job opportunities are, of course, far away. So they don't own a car, and they need to rely on public transport, specifically buses. But services are not frequent, and they do not allow them to be at their job on time. So they are unemployed at the beginning. They do not have access to frequent and reliable transport. They cannot get a job, and they cannot keep a job. They cannot get a car because they do not have the funds to do so. And this is something that keeps going on, and that will really impact somebody's possibility to improve their situation. And when it is at such an early stage in your career, that will impact these people's life for the rest of their lives, literally.
Maybe Martin, do you want to sort of respond to that? Because I think there was bits about your strategy in trying to respond to that. I feel like there's a lot about bus services, but there's a lot. I mean, the time that we're recording this, we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis. The report was kind of done a little bit before that. It's got so acute. We're seeing interest rates rise, squeeze on households, more rental market, people being squeezed on that. So it's an incredibly difficult time. I guess the solutions, it's great that Transport for the North is really trying to do this, but it's that the headwinds are really strong. So I don't know.
So I think for me, this is the reason why this is such a critical piece of work for us is we've recently published the revised version of our strategic transport plan, and what's driving that is a focus on outcomes that are place-based and put the user at the heart of it. And I think what we've seen with the work on transport-related social exclusion is to help us really understand and have a tool that then allows promoters of schemes to target and develop solutions that meet the needs of the place and the people. And I think that's important because we're often focused on how do we secure the funding to deliver. I think what we've got to be doing is switching the telescope around and saying, where do we need to get to? What is it that we're trying to achieve in terms of outcomes? And then use the tools that we've developed and make them available to our partners to develop solutions that can then be implemented. And for me, Justin, this is also kind of very much in tune with what CIHT is trying to do around diversity and inclusion, because for me, the solutions we're proposing and developing as professionals should meet the needs of our communities. And for me, there's absolutely no excuse these days for being able to not understand the types of people, the demographics, the cultural, the ethnic, the heritage of these communities, and understanding that those factors will have influences on people's travel choices. So this is really powerful, I think, as a tool to help people understand their communities, to be able to develop solutions that respect and address the needs of those communities. And hopefully that will then allow the funding to actually flow in the right direction. I'm under no illusions. The challenge of funding for investment in transport is challenging, but I think the first step is getting back to that focus on outcomes that are in a place for the user, and that allows us to shift the thinking. So I think this is very much in tune with what the institution's trying to do around that equality, diversity and inclusion agenda as well. When we talk about EDI in transport, it's about representation, but this is a practical, real example for me of what it means to communities and the work we do, which is why EDI is fundamental to absolutely everybody in the profession. It's not a nice to do, it's an absolute essential part of our thinking about who our communities are, what differences they are, and how those might impact or shape the solutions we develop for them. That, for me, is EDI made real.
I think the point on that is really key. Another quote that really struck me was, and it reads, transport staff can mistake sufferers of dementia or Alzheimer's for alcoholics and treat them poorly when routes are forgotten or they ask too many questions. I think the awareness piece is huge. CIHT is trying to do work actually in this area of people with dementia and kind of planning transport for that. So we are really trying to equip our members with a enlightened awareness and try and run that through the bus centre of excellence. But it does feel topical to actually ask about bus provision, because Sara, you mentioned about the kind of aspects of car related kind of pressures. Maybe just frame that a little bit, and then maybe we could ask Martin a bit about where you see how does the bus sector kind of equip that. But I'd like to ask the kind of elasticities, the kind of how price affects demand. I think we'd seen the price cap on bus fares, the £2 bus fare cap, did increase demand. So presumably the pricing of services is quite important, Sara, but maybe say a little bit about how the concept of elasticities work and any of the impacts of that. And then Martin, maybe on bus provision after.
Absolutely. So one very interesting thing that came out from the Transport for the North report is forced car ownership. So people that live in this disadvantaged area might not be able to rely on public transport or active travel, and therefore they might start thinking about owning a car, which is though a very onerous cost. And if we think about buying a car itself, if we think about road taxes and fuel and so on, it can be at the end of the year very heavy for people to undertake. And what this does, actually, it doesn't solve the problem about public transport. It just shifts the problem somewhere else and still remains an economic burden for people. And what happens is that by shifting it away from public transport, there will be less demand and less pressure on the public transport to be planned and to provide a seamless and better service, which ends up again in a situation in which it reinforces itself, where we do not improve the public transport service because people now rely on cars. But again, economically speaking, for the single individual, this will still be a burden, whether it is about paying tickets for getting public transport or owning a car. And forced car ownership is actually more onerous than relying on public transport.
So I think for me, just building on that, I think what this work and indeed other work we've done on our regional decarbonisation strategy but also the work we've done on it, updating the independent economic review, really does reinforce, to my mind, first of all, the critical importance of local bus services. But more importantly, we've got to get to a place where we're not just thinking about these things in terms of a transport issue and a transport solution. They are an investment. The investment we make in bus services, local bus services, should be seen as a way of addressing economic, social, and environmental challenges. And I'm often kind of look at what has happened on some places in continental Europe where cities have introduced free public transport. Now, it's not free, there's a cost associated, but the cost of having free public transport is offset by the improvements in social, environmental, and economic qualities. And I think that's where, again, one of our key roles as a subnational transport body is helping with this evidence base, helping with developing the tools that allow professionals in their local communities to understand these issues, and then helping our colleagues and in partners to apply these so that we get that more rounded picture, that it's not just a transport issue with a transport solution, it's a community issue, it's a people issue, it's an economic issue, of which there is a contribution from the transport sector. But actually it's serving much broader issues as well. Our independent economic review has highlighted, it's not just about investing in transport, but it's investing in skills, it's investing in education, the economic opportunities. And I think it just reminds us as to why we may be specializing in transport, but as professionals, we need to be comfortable to look beyond our professional boundaries to understand the linkages and the interactions, and perhaps more importantly, be comfortable drawing in and using the tools that we've got to make the argument for investment. And as an example, I mean, the tools that we've been developing around transport related social exclusion, they're already being kind of integrated within our analysis tools. We've used some of the information and data sets to feed into the work we've done on behalf of the department around the strategic outline business case for Northern Powerhouse Rail, because these are outcomes that we're looking to achieve because of the investment. And I think in terms of buses, we know there's a funding challenge. You're right, we've seen some very positive reaction in terms of the benefit of capping fares in the way that they have been done. We need to be able to capture the economic and social and environmental consequences of that, so that we can say, look, actually extending the investment in fare capping actually brings a much bigger, broader aspect. And it's interesting, Sara, that you talked about and Justin, you talked about the sort of younger people. I mean, that is one of the things that really leaps out at you, that transition from full-time education into the first stage in work. It's such a big step, and we need to make it as easy as possible for both employers and employees to kind of start the journey that they want to go on in their adult life. But equally, we know with an aging population, we know that if we can keep adults mobile and independent longer, then we know they'll have a better quality of life. We know that they'll have less demand on social services and health services. And so again, it's an illustration for me about how we've, yes, we're focusing on transport, but we've got to have our mindset about, well, what does this bring in terms of those wider benefits? Maintaining people's independence by having good local bus services will reduce the cost on social services, will reduce the cost on health services as a consequence of having longer lives. And I think, again, part of this for me is about having the tools to understand these linkages, but also to quantify them so that we can make the argument that investing in bus services isn't just a transport issue, it's a society issue, it's a community issue.
One of the things I liked about the report as well, I mean, there's lots, I think I would urge people to look at it. It's very accessible as a report. Was some of the other, and I'll quote them, I'd like to cycle here, but don't feel safe. The roads seem less safe, more speeding and aggressive behavior. And then another quote, I had to squeeze past the van on the pavement and the wheels of my buggy fell off of the curb and the shopping and the baby falling over into the road. I mean, these illustrations of, I think you mentioned community people, economic factor issues, but also place as well. I think it's good because it's the wider environment that transport sits within, that sometimes people can think of rail services, bus services, driving, but actually that movement of walking, wheeling, cycling are all really there at the top of the transport hierarchy. And it really comes out quite strongly in the report as well. And I think that's quite important given government ambitions to increase people's trips made by walking and cycling and wheeling. So kind of thoughts on that, maybe as a kind of concluding point, just about the wider environment that transport sits within. I think that was quite a powerful message that I'd seen.
Well, fundamentally, we're about trying to connect people and places with services and opportunities. So accessibility is important, and remembering that if it's accessible for all, then everybody can have the opportunity. But I think you're right, Justin, that safety, sometimes we talk about safety in the context of road safety quite often, and over the years we've made progress. There's still much more that we can do there. But I think this issue about personal safety and understanding how that impacts upon different age groups, but also different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. People of different backgrounds have different aspects and concerns when it comes to safety. But fundamentally, if we come back to why are we doing these things, about connecting people, places, services and opportunities, and if we have at the heart of what we're doing this thought about what's the outcome we're trying to achieve in this place for our communities, I think that then shifts the thinking of the transport professional. I think it means that we can be more confident that we're going to be able to respond to our community's needs. And actually, at the end of the day, we're going to get a much more better quality of life for everybody. And at the end of the day, that's kind of what I think we're about here. And you're right, there's a lot of challenges, but the first step to that is about having the information, the knowledge, and then our role as professionals is to apply that in a place to the benefit of our communities.
It's useful to look at the next steps of where this goes, because things change, obviously. So COVID, then you have cost of living, and then you have decarbonisation, and tracking this over time to see how to be able to make sure that people can have opportunities within that it's going to work for people is key.
I mean, one thing to say is this is a piece of work which you need to keep up to date. So we're committed as we are with all of our sort of analytical capability of keeping it up to date. We'll do a full update using the most up-to-date information probably next year. We'll probably do a sort of a light touch update in 25. But I think that's, again, part of our role is to be that sort of source of trusted knowledge, if you like, that can be used to do these things. And I think for me, this is about it does come back, Justin, to looking beyond transport for the solutions to transport problems. So as I touched on in the conversation, it's the independent economic review reminds us that it's about investment in people as well. It's about investment in skills. It's about investment that enables businesses to make their decision to come and invest in the place. So transport is part of it. It can be a catalyst for people making a decision to invest. But let's move on from thinking that if there's a transport problem, we need to think about what the transport solution is, because I think the work of subnational transport bodies, which increasingly for me starts to look and feel like a subnational infrastructure body. What we've done on EV charging infrastructure, we've worked with the energy supply systems because they are integral to delivering that. When it comes to some of the solutions we want about flexible ways of delivering services, you kind of get into the need for ubiquitous digital connectivity, both fixed and mobile. And so actually some of the requirements to achieve a transport outcome lies in aligning activity in other areas, and that's something that we're starting to explore as a subnational transport body. It's some of the toolkits that we've got that allow us to do that, and we're adding to our databases and data sets. So we're adding in all the bus routes into our data sets. We're developing tools that will allow us to share with our partners the ability to take a judgment about what would be the likely switch between modes if you did things on bus service provision. These are all adding capability to the sector that addresses issues about how do you actually deliver. And I'm really keen that the strategic transport plan, yes, it needs to set a direction of where we need to be by the end of 2050. And in terms of social exclusion, we talk about reducing by about 1 million the number that are at high risk. But it's also about implementation. So it's about how do we make things easier for people to deliver, to implement. It may be about simplifying funding streams. It might be about combining funding streams. It might be about giving some certainty on funding streams. I think that focus on delivery and implementation is an area which we often moan about, but we don't really give as much attention to it as we do perhaps strategy writing. And I'm really keen that as we put the new strategic transport plan together, we give just as much attention to that as we do with the strategy itself. And that comes back to the point you raised earlier about how do you secure the investment in things like bus services that actually means the ambition to achieve this is actually delivered on the ground. And that's an exciting area. It's a challenging area for us to go into, but I think it's the area we need to go into, because we know the way we deliver at the moment isn't delivering the outcomes we're seeking. So we need to do something different. We need to have a reason for doing it different, and we need to have some rationale and confidence that when we're doing these things, we can demonstrate that it will be a benefit. And like I said, that's all very exciting stuff for me in terms of what Transport for the North is doing. And I think it's an area where there's a lot of potential to do work and to work with people like the institution on pushing the boundaries a little bit.
So shifting it from transport exclusion to actually how transport can make society socially inclusive, I think is the aspiration, or how it thinks broadly about it. So that feels like the research lays the challenge down, but actually the opportunity of where the sector can go. I think it's a phenomenally good piece of work actually to put down on the table of the sector and really share it, both from a kind of analytical data side, but also from that, I think almost well, certainly as powerfully, because you need the data, but that lived experience really came out. There's so many quotes I could draw, and I think time kind of doesn't allow for it, but I would urge people to read the report. And
the reason why we changed the name when we published the strategy to socially inclusive transport strategy, that was a very conscious choice for exactly the reasons you gave there, Justin. It was about, there is always a risk when you talk about social exclusion that people see it as a negative. We wanted it to be about a positive. The other thing that we're doing, can't remember how far the guys have got, but we're doing some work around health and well-being, and in particular the extent to which transport infrastructure acts as a barrier to movement. Again, the idea being there to develop a tool that can be applied and allow people to kind of get a feel for it. It's I do think it's one of our key roles is this pushing the evidence base. The fact that we're a public body means we make the information available to everybody. It's there. we've got regional leadership, obviously, we can apply it to the work we do in the business cases, but we're also making it available more widely. So, we can share what we're doing with our colleagues in the other subnational transport bodies, for example. We can share it with people in other government departments as we are. And I think it just shifts the conversation in a way that is really helpful, because you've heard me say this, Justin, before. If our answer to a community around decarbonisation is we need to invest in EV vehicles and that's the solution, I don't see how that is relevant to a single parent on minimum wage in the gig economy. It has to be relevant to these people, to our communities we're serving, and that's where the linkage is so important, to switch our mindset away from being a transport professional to being somebody in that situation.
Thanks so much, Martin, for your time today. That's Martin Tugwell, the Chief Executive of Transport for the North and former President of CIHT, I would add. Thank you, Martin. And Sara, thank you also for helping shape the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joining a professional body has never been more important. Join thousands of other professionals just like you who are getting ahead with CIHT membership. Go to the CIHT website and discover exclusive resources and why the leaders and future leaders of the sector are members with CIHT.